Hello everyone. This is the first lecture of week 14. This week we're looking at Constantinople, the city of Istanbul at the time of the Byzantine Empire. So this is our one of the last cities that we're going to discuss. One of the really fascinating things about Istanbul is that it is a living, breathing city in the contemporary world, and actually one of the largest cities in the world today, with a population of 15 million people living in it. So that's very unlike any of the cities that we have studied so far. So I actually want to spend my first lecture this week on this idea of Constantinople, Istanbul as a global city. After we look at some of the objectives of this week, what we will study. So Istanbul, very importantly, was the capital city of two empires. The Byzantine Empire from the 4th century to the 15th century. And then after the Ottoman conquest of 1453, it was the capital of the Ottoman Empire until the collapse, the demise of the empire in the 1920s. And today, it is a metropolitan city. It's a very cosmopolitan and transcontinental city with more than 15 million people living in it. So let's take a look at, so we're going to deal with what it means to deal with a city that is this massive metropolis today as a global city, and how do we account for its history? How do we study its history? How do we study its urban space and its development through these really long centuries? Let's look at some of the objectives for this week. First of all, in this video lecture, I'm going to talk about the role of the city in the contemporary world and how the deep urban history of the city really relates to and impacts or shapes this global character of Istanbul as a cosmopolitan place. It was the capital of two empires, the Byzantine and Ottoman empires, for more than 1,500 years. So it's a very, very long time. And during this time, up until about 17th century, it was actually the largest sort of recorded city in the world. We will look at some of these ideas of globality, but also the idea of how this very long history percolates, how it's suspended within the air, within the city, when you walk its streets, when you visit its neighborhoods. How does that history materialize? We will also talk about the historical context and to discuss the political, cultural, and social context of the development of the city of Constantinople. And that's in the second video lecture. We're going to look at specifically the time of the sort of earlier part of the Byzantine Empire, particularly from Constantine to Justinian, and look at the construction of the city, the development of the city in this time period. Also, in the third lecture, we're going to turn our attention more closely to the urban landscape of Byzantine Constantinople, particularly, and how look at how the urban center became a place of attention, the place of sort of public performance of imperial liturgies, imperial religious spectacles, and imperial propaganda, site of imperial politics within the Byzantine Empire. And we're going to look at a number of architectural projects that actually shape that urban center, and also study texts like the Book of Ceremonies, which talk about various protocols of how ceremonies were actually practiced within Istanbul itself. So we're going to look at the relationship between those ceremonies and the urban landscape. I'm starting with this concept of the global city that was put forward by Saskia Sessen in her article, "The Global City: Introducing a Concept." And this is really apropos, particularly for Istanbul. And in this quote that's on the screen, that she describes what she means by the global city as an important concept. She says the economic fortunes of global cities become increasingly disconnected from their broader hinterlands or even their national economies. We can see here the formation, at least incipient, of transnational urban systems. The idea here is that this fascinating idea of the global city, which in a way breaks away from its own hinterland, it breaks away from the politics of the nation state in which it exists, and becomes incompatible with the economic structures within the nation state, and goes beyond beyond the rest of the country. And this is the unusual kind of trajectory of global cities today that we see. Let's say, if you think about the last 10-15, the top 10-15 populated cities around the world, you see a kind of a radical departure of these cities gradually away from their nation states. In the recent municipal elections in Turkey in 2019, in March 2019, we actually saw this play out quite a bit. As you know, while the country, the modern Republic of Turkey, is being governed by a relatively conservative Islamist neoliberal capitalist party, the Justice and Development Party, AKP. In these municipal elections in 2019, Istanbul actually elected a social democrat candidate from the main opposition party. This happened not only in Istanbul, but also in major large cities of the country, including Ankara and Izmir on the Aegean coast. So here I'm showing you a fascinating map that actually shows the sort of financial space, sort of really comparing sort of the actual cartographic space, which has the sort of standard cartographic topographic map of Turkey with its provinces, and you see how small Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir are, and then you see in the map on top the actual financial weight of those cities, and how sort of this opposition party has actually won the elections in those three major cities that are represented in red. I love these kinds of maps that actually kind of really distort the space and show the actual sort of weight of, let's say, the financial weight here of those elections. So this city of Istanbul had many names over the centuries. It was, as I mentioned, it was the capital of two empires, Byzantine Empire and the Ottoman Empire. It's a deeply historical place, and this is what I also want to talk about. today. What is this kind of historicity that it brings from being the capital of those two empires, and how that kind of historicity, that feeling of being historical, it sort of really percolates within the city. And in the final sort of slides that I'd like to really talk a little bit about this Gezi movement, this social movement that really very much characterized Istanbul. It's a social movement on ecological and urban rights, and how the city, the spaces of the city kind of really became very crucial. The urban space of the city became very crucial in that kind of social movement, and also within evoking those histories. I'd like to come back to that at the end of this lecture, and this idea of history that percolates, right? What I mean by this is that it's in the air, it's in buildings, it's in this spaces, surfaces, smells within the urban culture. This is something that we haven't really had a chance to talk about, because all of the cities that we have actually studied were with the exception of Jerusalem, of course, and this really applies to Jerusalem as well. But all of the cities that we've studied in the earlier, those ancient cities are gone. They're dead. They're ruins. Or their archaeological sites. But Jerusalem and Istanbul are where traces of multiple periods of history simultaneously are present within the city. Just a couple of examples. One of my favorite buildings in the city is this Galata Tower, this Genoese tower that was built in 1348, that Christea Turris, which overlooked the Golden Horn. This sort of Han building, Narmanda Han, which served as a Russian embassy between 1831 and 1880, a Russian prison between 1880 to 1913, and later became an apartment complex that housed very important intellectuals, including painters and writers in Turkey. And today it was recently restored, and a very fascinating place and in the historic center of Istanbul. The Basilica Cistern, it's a massive underground cistern that an ancient cistern that was built in the 6th century. And it was built at the time of Justinian with the Roman spolia. It's a major tourist attraction today, but it's about a 1400-year-old structure underground holding water. And this mosque, the so-called Arab mosque, which was originally built in the 14th century as a Roman Catholic church. And converted to mosque by the Ottomans in 1475 onwards, and then later given by two Muslim Arab refugees from Andalus, who escaped from the Spanish Inquisition, which just shows you how certain buildings, how this kind of history really is suspended in the air in these buildings. If you look at the word percolate, I'm very interested in this sort of. This is a very fascinating sort of concept of kind of really history simmering. It's a very physical sort of thing to cause a solvent to pass through a permeable substance, especially for extracting a soluble constituent, or to ooze, to trickle through a permeable substance. Seep is really great, I think, for that and to spread gradually. This is really how, in a way, it would be a really good way to describe how history is present within the urban space. And I'm showing you some photographs. The Genoese Tower on the left, Galata Tower, and a photograph with a cat in the courtyard of Narmanlahan, that Russian prison that I. It's a photograph that I took. These are two photographs that I took in Istanbul that I'm sharing with you. And finally, I'd like to wrap up this lecture by talking a little bit about this social movement that shaped this city of Istanbul in more recent years. This is the social movement of urban rights, and particularly political ecology, ecological rights, and ecological justice movement. It was run mostly by high school and graduate and university students heavily, but became a massive social movement in 2013, between 27th of May 2013 to August 20th. So it was really covered the sort of entire summer months of several months, three month long movement, very powerful protests that are associated with actually the Occupy movement in the U.S. And also the Arab Spring movement in various Middle Eastern and North African countries. It started in the Gezi Park. That's why it's called Gezi movement. It started in the major park in the center of historic center of Istanbul, where you see a photograph of that park. A very important park for citizens of Istanbul, and it's a very ideologically very important place. The plan of the government at that time was actually to cut the trees of this park and transform it into a shopping mall. A shopping mall that was supposed to be built in the form of Ottoman barracks. So the government was actually trying to achieve two things at a time. One, this kind of neo-Ottoman imperialist project of rebuilding Ottoman barracks, but also to transform a kind of a public space that everyone used, into a shopping mall, a commercial space of capitalism. And so, and of course the community, especially the student community in Turkey, became very agitated by this really extreme, politically challenging position, and they decided to protect the trees. So they camped at the park for 3 months straight, protecting the site, protecting the trees from demolition, and an enormous social movement actually erupted from there, with great humor, great creativity, establishment of barricades, massive confrontations with the state police, and also it created, with the graffiti, it created its really radically creative visual culture within the city as well. And I'm showing you really one of the sort of memorable moments within during that movement, where a barricade is constructed against the police forces, and the protesters hijacked a bulldozer to actually protect themselves against the tear gas that was being thrown at them by the police. So this is a moment that the city urban spaces were activated in an unparalleled way, and the streets were covered with graffiti that was that brought in this politics of ecology, politics of urban rights. The rights to the public space was brought in into the city. So I'll stop there. I'm hoping that we will discuss some of that in our discussion on Wednesday. The next lecture is going to be about the historical context of Byzantine Istanbul, So we'll go back to that history a little bit. Thank you.